All right. Hi, folks. Welcome in. Good afternoon, everybody. On behalf of For Space, welcome in for this afternoon's event, Keeping Fossil Fuels in the Ground, the Future of Climate Policy, whereby you'll hear from Angela Carter, who will be introduced very shortly. This event is part of a week-long series of events on sustainability and the climate crisis, brought to you by the Loyola College for Diversity and Sustainability and the Loyola Sustainability Research Center in collaboration with For Space. Those of you who aren't familiar with For Space, let me tell you a little bit about it. We are located on the downtown campus of Concordia University. We are located in downtown Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, on unceded Indigenous land. And as a physical space, we operate as the front door to the university, whereby we invite you, all of you, to come in and experience any number of interactive live events on a daily basis, and at the same time, engage with the research, various initiatives, or course activities that are brewing at Concordia. We invite you to check out our schedule of events by going to concordia.ca/4. Those of you wanting to share this talk with your friends and colleagues, you're in luck. We are currently recording and live streaming at CU For Space on Facebook, so I'll pop those links in the chat momentarily. You're more than welcome to join in the conversation today. Angela will deliver a talk, a kind of PowerPoint presentation and a talk for the first little bit, and then afterwards we're going to open things up for your questions. So if you do have questions today, wonderful. We'd love to hear from you. You're more than welcome to raise your virtual hand and we'll unmute you so that you can speak, or otherwise we invite you to pop your question into the Q&A, making Amy Potit's life a little bit easier as she moderates the session and navigates the places where people can write things. Having said that, the chat is activated, so we welcome your comments throughout. Should you have any comments or reflections, that's what it's there for. Okay, I'm done. On that note, it's my pleasure to pass the floor over to you, Amy. Welcome.
Yes, thank you. Welcome, everybody. So I'm Amy Poteet. I'm co-director of the Loyola Sustainability Research Center. It's a very great pleasure to be hosting, along with the Loyola College for Sustainability and Diversity, this week of discussion about sustainability and the climate crisis. Today is our doubly green day, St. Patrick's Day, as well as talking about green things. I'm absolutely delighted to introduce our speaker for today, Angela Carter. Angela Carter is an associate professor of political science at the University of Waterloo. She's also got a couple of other affiliations here. I'm not sure what Art First is, but she's associate director of Arts First, and she also has an affiliation with the Balsillie School of International Affairs, and I may have mixed up the sequence of the names of the school. She has long been working on issues related to fossil fuels, both the production in Canada of fossil fuels and efforts to reduce that. And more recently, the Keep It in the Ground movement, which she'll be talking to us about today. So since she's going to be talking to us about that today, I'm going to simply hand things over to Angela. It's your turn.
All right, hello. It's so great to be here. Thank you for inviting me, Amy and Rebecca and Anna and Douglas, for offering support to make sure it all goes smoothly. Montreal is my favorite city in Canada, so it's terrible for me that I can't be there with you. So I hope that you will promise that you will have me back when things open up again. Okay, I'm going to depend on that. All right, so what I have for you over the next, it's about 25, 26 minutes. I've got a presentation that outlines some key ideas that I want to share with you. I know that everybody is really zoomed out. We're a year into having to live and work like this, so I know it's hard. So I've tried to keep it as interesting as I can with some images and some of my favorite art from the Keep It in the Ground movement that is growing in our midst. So I will start now by sharing my screen with you. Okay, so does that look good? You can see the slide. Okay, great. All right, so today I'd like to share a little bit about my research and its implications for Canada. But even more than that, I'd really like to take a moment to celebrate some of the great activist and scholarly work that is working towards keeping fossil fuels in the ground. And I imagine some of you already are involved in this effort, so I want you to, encourage you to continue, and also if you're not already involved, to invite you to join in what I see as the future of climate policy. So let's get started. So over the next 30 minutes or so, pardon me, I have a three-part focus. So I'd like to chat with you about where this supply-side climate policy idea came from, and then focus right in on keep it in the ground bans, looking from the origins to early findings of a new research project that I'm working on now. But, and then at the end, I'd like to turn our attention towards what this all could mean or might mean for Canada. But first, I want to give you a quick sense of my path to this work. I began focusing on the environmental costs of Canadian oil production over 15 years ago now. At the time, NGOs, so environmental, non-governmental organizations, were beginning to issue warnings about the intensification of a really destructive form of fossil fuel extraction that was happening in Alberta. And this is pictured here through the work of Edward Bertinsky. Everyone at the time called it the tar sands. Now we've heard it as the oil sands sometimes too. So I'm from a working class family, and my family's life intersected with oil and gas in a lot of different ways. My father worked briefly offshore off the coast of Newfoundland, which is where I'm from and where I'm speaking to you from today. And both of my brothers worked in the tar sands, the oil sands in Alberta. So I've been intrigued for a long time about the environmental and also the social costs of Canada's oil boom. My doctoral work became my new book, which is called Fossilized, and it focuses on Canada's three major oil producing provinces. So it's Alberta, Saskatchewan, and here at home for me, Newfoundland and Labrador. So basically what the book does is it traces how each of these provinces over the period of the oil boom, so 2005 to 2015, at the richest point in history, they allowed environmental regulatory capacity to wilt, or they actively undercut it as oil production was reaching unprecedented levels. Okay, so basically I through this book project, I lay out exactly how that happened. And so as you can imagine, this was pretty depressing work. So after this project, I vowed to focus on solutions that we needed to engage with a forward-looking project. I found my answer in supply-side climate policy and inspiring events that I saw unfolding in late 2017, and I'll come back to that point. So first set of comments on rethinking the climate crisis and supply-side climate policy. And I know this is really common knowledge, so I won't belabor this point, but our global challenge is plain. We need to reduce emissions quickly and dramatically in order to have something of a stable climate and a livable planet. The global consensus that's shown here via the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is stark. We need to act yesterday, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. Now we need quite big change. Now, so far, the dominant governance approach, so the dominant way of thinking about this issue, which is enshrined in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, so the UNFCCC, is to account for those emissions at the end of pipe. So on the demand side, where fossil fuels are consumed. And we do this in a couple of ways, most notably carbon pricing, energy efficiency, low carbon technology. Now, the thing is, though, that this approach has been silent on fossil fuel supply. And to date, we know that it hasn't been effective. And so you'll see here from Climate Action Tracker, this global presentation of just how badly the global community is missing a decarbonization pathway that's consistent with 1.5 degrees of warming. So we could see this problem, though, from a completely different direction. We can flip this entirely if we focus on the origins of global emissions. Now, fossil fuels, we know that they're the lead source of emissions that are causing the climate crisis. You'll see here that it's something to the scale of 76% of emissions are coming from fossil fuels, and other research is indicating that in the first decade of the 2000s, fossil fuels accounted for nearly 80% of emissions. Okay, so we can be even more specific, though, about the source of the problem. So HEDI has documented that 63% of cumulative, so total global emissions over time, from the mid-1700s to 2010, they came from just 90, what he calls carbon major entities. So these are primarily investor-owned or state-owned fossil fuel companies. We are beginning to be able to attribute emissions and therefore increments of temperature change or temperature increases to particular companies. Now, what's important here, a really key detail, is that half of the emissions have occurred after 1986. And that's the point at which we know that firms knew the climate risks of their lines of business. In fact, it's been well documented now that for at least 40 years, these companies knew the impact of fossil fuel extraction and consumption on the global climate, and yet they continued to increase extraction, profiting enormously in the process, all while deliberately discrediting or spreading doubt about climate science, misinforming the public, actively lobbying government to support more oil production, and also to prevent or delay political action. And so this is basically encapsulated in that hashtag that Exxon knew. Exxon knew for a long time, and what Exxon did was keep on taking us down this path and preventing us from taking the actions that we needed to. So that's the rear view look. But if we look ahead, we have international research institutes that are tracking the production gap. So that's the gap, the difference between countries' fossil fuel extraction plans and climate safety, so 1.5 degrees. What these research institutes working in collaboration have found is that companies and countries are banking on extracting 120% more fossil fuels than would keep us within a 1.5 degree of warming pathway. And money is still being poured into that sector to foster and boost production. So, given the frustration with continually rising emissions from demand side climate policy, researchers have begun to focus on supply side options that really get to the heart of the crisis by restricting fossil fuel production. And when we look at that literature, and I've got a couple of really key pieces noted for you here on the slide, what we see is there's actually a menu of supply side options that are available to restrict that extraction. Everything from ending subsidies that I just mentioned to legal challenges to fossil fuel companies, and then to outright bans, which is my focus. So that takes us to the second part of what I wanted to share with you. Bans on fossil fuel extraction, keeping fossil fuels in the ground, or KIG, as I might refer to it. These are arguably the most effective supply side initiatives because they stem the flow of fossil fuels right at their origins. So really a potentially powerful way to make change here. Now, the effort to keep fossil fuels in the ground, of course, long predates scholarly attention to supply side climate policy. It began in long-standing community resistance and civil society organizations pushing back, so significant grassroots movements that we saw in Nigeria and Ecuador in the mid-1990s. And so the organization Oil Watch was founded in Ecuador in 1996 on the very premise that given the social and environmental costs of oil production, we just couldn't continue extracting oil and gas as we had previously done. And then, this was nearly 25 years ago, Greenpeace released an early report that noted that the global community had to constrain fossil fuel extraction, otherwise we would far exceed what they refer to as a carbon budget based on keeping warming to 2 degrees. So, as I say, that was about 25 years ago. It took that logic of banning fossil fuel extraction, it took until about 2007 before that entered mainstream debate, when the Guardian journalist George Monbiot, he cheekily proposed a single technology to solve the climate crisis. And that technology was to simply leave it in the ground. So local and national campaigns largely focused on the phase out of coal or hydraulic fracturing, so fracking, were created all over the world around that time. And they were joined in 2011 at COP17 in a Leave It in the Ground coalition. So this is also the time when Carbon Tracker released its very seminal, important report titled Unburnable Carbon. So that introduced the concept of the carbon bubble. And then that report inspired environmental activist Bill McKibben of 350.org to publish his landmark Rolling Stone article on global warming's terrifying new math, and then also to launch a global divestment campaign. So The scholarly literature took a little bit, to catch up to these really important changes that were happening. By 2015, though, we had a body of scholarly work in earnest focusing on this direction. It's now a rich and engaging body of work, and I've got some key pieces there that I really value shown just to give you a taste, a flavor of that. But what this research is starting from the premise that to have some semblance of climate stability, we've got to keep about 2/3 of existing fossil fuels in the ground. They can't be extracted. In Canada, it's about 70%, given what McLeod and Ekins showed us in 2015. So the short message is that we can't extract much of what we found, and we definitely need to stop looking for more. And so that's underpinning this literature. The literature itself identifies several key barriers to keep it in the ground or KIG movement. You could also think of these on the flip side as opportunities. So we've got the political power of incumbent industry actors, so fossil fuel firms, for example, or governments that are very dependent on that activity. They can deploy lobbying or campaign financing, representing a real barrier to keep it in the ground movements. But at the same time, as many of you have probably experienced or participated in, civil society actors, social movements can push back against industry and pressure governments. Similarly, existing subsidies or the dependence of some communities on fossil fuel extraction, the continuation of long-term infrastructure investments, the cultural importance of oil. So a petro-culture, as my colleague has developed that notion. So these are all very important to keeping us locked onto oil. But at the same time, we can imagine ways to unlock that carbon entanglement through the promotion of low carbon technologies, using principles of just transition, clear vision for a low carbon future, a future that looks better after oil. So those are some sort of general insights that we draw from the literature. Now, I mentioned to you that 2017 was a turning point in my research, and it was because at that moment, following on Costa Rica's earlier example, a wave of countries placed bans, national bans on oil extraction. So France, Belize, Ireland, New Zealand, and more recently Denmark, with others coming, we hear. So how is this happening? Why is this happening? And what can we do to amplify what I've come to know as the global first movers in national efforts to keep fossil fuels in the ground? And so my research agenda is asking those questions and trying to understand from these cases where these really globally important policies are coming from, and how can we amplify them so that even major producing states are feeling pressure to use some of these policy tools too. So working with a couple of excellent PhD students, I am so lucky. I am mapping the pathways to these national bans. Last year, Janetta McKenzie and I published an article that stakes out the literature we're using in our theoretical approach, and we're in the midst of fieldwork, or we should have been until COVID happened. COVID isn't helping. So far, what we understand that the pathway to KIG is basically, it's coming from a constellation of factors. So we know that these bans are coming from local defined campaigns that somehow scale up. We know that they're horizontally organized, so broad-based and diverse coalitions across a country that are vertically integrated, so connected to international actors or organizations that have more resources or experience. We know they're aided by well-placed allies, domestically or internationally. Also, these movements are seizing or creating political openings that improve their policy influence. And throughout, of course, they're sparked by and sustained by provocative ideas that resonate locally in those particular places. So before COVID happened, we went to Ireland to investigate how the notion of a national ban on fossil fuel extraction was developing. We interviewed key actors from civil society and industry and the environmental community, researchers, public service, political parties. Banning fossil fuel extraction was proposed in 2018 in the form of a climate emergency measures bill, and it was brought forward by a leftist people before profit party. And you can see here, that's my photo of one of the powerhouse parliamentarians who led that effort. So the party proposed that Ireland would block fossil fuel licenses as long as atmospheric carbon concentrations exceeded 350 parts per million. So it was a beautiful bill in its simplicity. Now, the bill lapsed with the February 2020 election, but the KIG idea is still alive. Prior to the election, the Prime Minister had announced a partial ban on further offshore oil exploration licenses. And then in June 2020, given the kind of coalition government that Ireland is working with right now, given the election results, the Green Party has managed to nudge the two centrist parties to basically amp up the ambition of the Prime Minister's ban to include natural gas. And they have proposed to ban new licenses for oil and gas exploration, as well as the importing of fracked natural gas. So I think that's important for the Quebec case. They've also proposed to withdraw funding and support for LNG terminals, as well as implement a just transition plan. So there's a lot of really interesting work that's coming out of Ireland right now. So where did this come from? So thinking back to what we imagined we would see, what were the constellation of factors? Well, there's a lot that are at play, and I've got them listed for you here. I just want, though, to cherry pick a couple that are, I think, really important and really engaging as well in the Irish case. So certainly in terms of ideas, the idea of moral obligation was very important in this case. And what was important here too was that TROCRA, which is a Catholic International Development Organization, they were a key leader and coordinator of the movement to keep fossil fuels in the ground. And they could draw on the legitimacy that they have in Irish society. And they could really, raise issues of human rights and moral obligation, or the immorality of Ireland's emissions and continued fossil fuel development. So that's something that really resonated with people in Ireland. Certainly there was a very dense and diverse, what some people called a symbiosis, among all sorts of different actors that chose a different strategy. They divided up the labor of mobilization, everything from inside, working with politicians, drafting bills, to outside, using civil disobedience to draw attention. The other thing that I would say here too is that the movement to keep fossil fuels in the ground had a very, very long history. Some people date it right back to 1970s and to anti-nuclear mobilizations, where people learned skills and learned ways of interacting with their politicians that they could apply then in future campaigns to keep fossil fuels in the ground. The last thing here is that many people have pointed to the stepping stone approach that was taken here. There was an anti-fracking bill that came in 2017. There was a divestment bill in 2018. Each of these pieces of legislation that were successful, that were implemented, basically these were wins that the mobilization could draw on, the movement could draw on, and each time they were upping their ambition a little bit more. So these are some of the things that led to those bans. We've got some work on the French case that's in progress, so on the case of France, and we're hoping to pursue New Zealand or Denmark case studies soon and bring this together to have something that can speak across these cases to you. So one thing, though, that I want to address here is the notion that we could argue that new bans like those in Ireland are actually no big deal, because many of these countries, these first movers, they're minor producers of oil and gas. The bans in some cases are piecemeal, or they're happening farther out in the future than we might like. Many of these countries have comparably small reserves. But I would argue, as a reply to that, that these bans have enormous symbolic power. What we see here is countries that are going so far as to prohibit oil extraction, given the risks that these fossil fuels pose to the global climate. We're in a new terrain here, potentially, of climate policy. What we might be seeing is first movers, early first movers, that are forwarding new norms that potentially could build to a critical mass, maybe towards a cascade of decarbonization. Indeed, these bans are already inspiring global initiatives to prevent the proliferation of fossil fuels. And this is coming from the work of Peter Newell and Andrew Sims. My hunch is that we are in the midst of important first wave fossil fuel extraction bans that are critically important to global decarbonization. So what does all this mean for Canada? I wanted to take just the last piece here to reflect on some of that, and then we can hopefully have a chat together. There are strong arguments for why Canada must be, should be, among the first countries to wind down fossil fuel extraction. Len Ferna has a beautiful piece that he published in 2018 that lays out global distributive justice criteria, indicating who those first movers should be. Rich countries that have the resources to transition, those that have benefited most from fossil fuel extraction, therefore the largest historical polluters. In particular, those countries that have the most carbon intensive, highest cost fossil fuels, where frontline communities have objected to extraction. Now, if you think of that as a checklist, you, I think, will agree with me that Canada checks all of those boxes. It makes sense that we should be one of the leading countries here, that we should move first. Now, there is evidence of efforts to keep fossil fuels in the ground in Canada. These are notably led by Indigenous communities, in particular women in those communities. We've seen multiple fracking bans, long-standing opposition to pipelines, and of course, ongoing opposition to pipelines and terminals and so forth. In Quebec, in your beautiful province, well, Quebec is leading the way in KIG efforts. Perhaps many of you are involved in these movements or these campaigns. I'd love to hear your thoughts when we do some Q&A on how these campaigns align or not with what I've presented here from the theory and from initial cases. It is very exciting to see as well. So not only opposition to fossil fuels, but very forward-looking efforts. So for example, le Front Commun pour la Transition énergétique and Québec Zen, to see these initiatives that are coming forward, not only to contest, but to present an alternative, a better alternative into the future. So very, very exciting. We also have a clear understanding, crystal clear understanding in this country about the necessity, both the environmental and the economic necessity of transitioning, and doing this in a way that protects workers and oil-dependent communities. We have precise plans that are now available to us. And I'd reference here work by Mark Lee and Seth Klein on the BC case. But for a Canada-wide view, Jim Stanford has recently published research that outlines exactly what needs to happen and how possible and how feasible it is for us to do that. And that's the steady path work. Now, yet, even though we have these, bubbling up from the grassroots, these initiatives across Canada to keep fossil fuels in the ground, we know that we should and we can just transition. We are continuing to live in a moment of a fundamental Canadian contradiction. On one hand, we are a country committed to deep decarbonization as required by the 2015 Paris Agreement. And on the other, we are committed to increasing oil extraction. It's almost like it's a no-brainer. We have this oil, of course, we're going to extract it. And Prime Minister Trudeau has kind of gone back and forth across those two sides of the fence, if you will, over time. And this is what this notion that we can have both an oil-based economy and bold climate action is what some call a new form of climate denialism. So, I mean, effectively, Trudeau was trying to ride two horses who are racing off on divergent paths. Canada has, and I won't belabor this point because I know you know it, we have experienced 30 years experience of making and missing by a long shot our emission reduction targets. Why is that? Well, the answer is pretty simple. Emissions from the oil and gas sector are the largest and they're the fastest growing source of emissions. They are outpacing efforts, heroic efforts in other sectors to decarbonize. Now, this slide here, I'm showing you that by 2030, nearly 40% of Canada's emissions budget to meet the Paris target would come from the oil and gas sector. So basically, by 2030, we're anticipating that the oil and gas sector is going to be eating up most of the share, if you will, of emissions available. Now, what's fascinating, though, is if we look to 2050. The look to 2050 is not at all promising. Last November, knowing everything it does about Canada's climate responsibilities, the Canada Energy Regulator projected that by 2050, Canada would be producing even more oil than it did in 2019. And the lion's share would be from Alberta's tar sands or oil sands, so about 86%. So this is me drawing on some data from the Canada Energy Regulator showing that we are not bending at all the curve of oil production. And because of that, it is very unlikely that we can meet any new targets, any new ambitious targets that we're starting to hear from the federal government. David Hughes, this is his work, has meticulously documented what the dilemma is here. Given Canada's oil extraction aspirations, what are Canada's chances of meeting a net zero 2050 target? Well, zero, basically, based on this information. I mean, I just draw your attention to that 2050 line in the bottom right-hand corner. And basically what this is showing you is that in 2050, based on the anticipated expansion of fossil fuel extraction, well, the oil and gas sector is still going to be emitting a huge amount of CO2 and equivalent. And there's no way, given status quo extraction or anticipated extraction, that we can ever get to zero. Now, while it is clear that the fossil fuel sector is blocking our ability to confront the climate crisis, the federal government continues to shovel enormous subsidies to the fossil fuel sector. In just the last year, while the federal government has indeed boosted support for decarbonization, and that's where we need to be, it's also provided over $18 billion US to the oil and gas sector. So you can watch this story unfold at energypolicytracker.org. So now where are we? We have a new president in the United States. Things are really getting interesting. President Biden has moved very quickly to cancel the Keystone XL permit, to freeze oil and gas and coal leasing on federal lands and offshore waters, and is moving to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies. Biden really gets supply side climate policy, so cutting this off from its origins. The White House is looking for Canada to align. So those are the words coming from the White House, to align our climate policies with its own bold initiatives. Now, next month on Earth Day, April 22nd, the United States is hosting the Climate Leaders Summit, and Trudeau is going to be there. Our Prime Minister will be there, apparently with a more ambitious climate plan in hand, but without reining in oil production, it will not be credible. So I would just like to leave you with letting you know that if you'd like to learn more about this or join in or contribute research in this vein, there are two great options for the grad students in the room or undergraduate students, and also faculty and professors and teachers. If you'd like to learn more about this, there's an excellent international conference, the Fossil Fuel Supply and Climate Policy Conference, that happens every 2 years. The Corporate Mapping Project is also a great place for information and engagement. They are offering to grad students intensive spring courses. So there's one happening this May as well. So check that out if you're interested. I am so grateful that you invited me. It was a real pleasure to be with you. I just wish we could actually be together. And I want to acknowledge support that I've received for the research from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, as well as the Corporate Mapping Project. So thank you for your time, and I look forward to our conversation right now.
Thank you very much.